I'm going to draw a lot of my remarks today from a book by Barbara Brown Taylor, An Altering World. It's a book that I think some of you from council were reading. I came across it, I don't remember how or where, but just about the same time the council was going through it, and liked it well enough and found it intriguing enough and drawing enough from me that I actually bought a second hardcover copy that I could destroy and put into a 3-ring binder so that I could continue to make notes on it. And the chapter that really got me the most out of her book was her chapter on Sabbath, which she titles Learning to Say No, the practice of saying no. I'll come back to that note later, but I want to come back to a vision of Sabbath that some of you my age and older may have from childhood or from your parents in childhood. When Sabbath was a day where there were a lot of, you can't do that. You have to dress in your best, you can't dress in your play clothes because you can't be out playing. You don't read mysteries, you read serious religious books. You don't watch TV unless you're picking up Bethel's televised service. You might even be sitting indoors in darkened rooms because Sabbath was a day to be thinking only serious and holy thoughts. Barbara Brown Taylor again quotes from Craig Carline, who's written a cultural history of Sabbath from the time of Babylon on. Sundays changed when the world changed. Stopping farming one day in the week during the Middle Ages was easy. Closing restaurants, amusement parks, and shopping malls when Americans with money are trying to spend it is impossible. I don't intend today to argue for a return to the blue laws or to the Sabbath law or sitting in darkened rooms reading only serious books. For one thing, I think it's far too much a divisive tactic. We deal with holy things on the Sabbath day and nothing else because nothing is holy except what we do on the Sabbath day, which means the stuff we do the rest of the week is not holy. And then we end up with God can't enter this building for a few hours on Sunday and non-existent in the rest of the world. And I don't think that's how it works. On the other hand, I think that there is some good and some good for us in returning to a sense that there is something good about setting a time aside to think about our relationship with God, the holiness of that relationship, and what God commands with observe the Sabbath. We have the 2 readings for today on Sabbath and keeping the Sabbath. What do they have to tell us? Our first reading, which comes from Deuteronomy, has Moses reminding, not telling, but reminding the people of Israel of the covenant that God has made with them. It's a promise that God made with them, that God would continue to be with them and in relationship with them and go with them. And in response, God gave us what we generally refer to as the 10 Commandments. But it's important, I think, for our consideration of Sabbath and for life generally, that we realize that the commandments aren't restrictions on what we do and aren't meant to pen us in, but are instead God's advice to us on continuing to live a life of freedom. The commandments begin with God's claim, I am the God who brought you out of slavery. I brought you out of the land of Egypt, where you were slaves, into the freedom of the promised land. You know I'm a God of freedom. Let me give you some suggestions for how to stay free, to not enslave yourself to other gods, to other things. And it is in fact because we are free that we're told to keep the freedom of Sabbath. This command in Deuteronomy is by no means the first mention of Sabbath. It occurs some 6 or 7 times in Leviticus, where it again is a reminder that we are called to the freedom of Sabbath because we are created in the image of God who is free to rest, free to refrain from working. And it's not, and this is I think most important for us today, it's not a command that we alone rest on the Sabbath and cease from work. Everyone in our community is to be granted that same freedom. that same liberty to not work. Not just us, but husbands, wives, children, servants, the beasts of the field, even the grain crops, the land around us, is to have a day of rest. We found Sabbath as well in the story of manna in the wilderness, where the people of Israel are starving in the wilderness. And God grants this astounding thing that we call manna, which means, what in the name of holy is this stuff? We've never seen this before. What is it? God grants daily enough for the people of Israel to eat. But if they try to keep it, it spoils. It won't last. We can't store it up. Only on the sixth day does God give a double portion that will last 2 days, so that the people can rest in the assurance of God on the Sabbath day. The Sabbath is set, and there will be enough to rest, to relax. People are free to rest on that seventh day. So observing Sabbath is also a reminder to us, as Carol mentioned, that we are dependent for God on everything. We cannot breathe without the air that God's given us. We cannot survive without the water God has given us. We can't produce food without the soil, the very rock that God has given us. Everything we make, everything we produce, everything we are so proud of doing comes at the root from God and from God's abundance. We are therefore called not to own this stuff, but to be good stewards of it. So at its root, Sabbath is a day of economics. Sabbath is a matter of economics. Observing Sabbath is to put ourselves back into right relationship with God, understanding that we're free to rest because of God's abundance. It also gets us back into right relationship with creation and with each other. To quote Brown once again, Sabbath is the great equalizer, the great reminder that we do not live on this earth, but in it, and that everything we do under the warming tent of this planet's atmosphere affects all who are woven into this web with us. Just because the land and the livestock cannot hire lawyers does not mean that they have not been violated. Their biblical rights are written down right there in the Bible, but other gods go on getting in the way. Because for far too many of us, not just us here in Zion, not just us here in Madison, not just us here in Dane County or in the United States, but us all over the world from time immemorial, money and progress and power have become gods, overriding the true God's command to just sit down and rest for a moment. Let things be. Because we want more and better and more and better again, we drive ourselves and the land and the sea and the air and each other far too hard. We turn our face from God's grace and abundance and make up new rules that will let us, and only a few of us, get a lot, get much more than we need at the expense of the many, who all too often don't get enough. So to observe Sabbath, to rest in God's grace, is to resist the voices of the world that keep pounding at us to want more, to have more, to make more, to build more. To observe Sabbath is to rest in our freedom in God's grace, and to resist and to speak against the empire of money and power. To observe Sabbath is to break away from the idol of prestige and power, and to see ourselves as one with each other and all of creation. In a time when there are strident voices on both the right and the left, when accusations of class welfare flow freely from both sides against the other, perhaps it is time to reclaim this promise of Sabbath. Perhaps it's time to understand, once again, that everyone and everything needs to have time to rest from work and to simply be. Perhaps it's time to understand the gifts that Sabbath can give us. The gift to be in creation rather than apart from it. The gift to be in communion with others rather than in competition. and the gift to be satisfied with enough rather than always needing more. On a personal note, all too often I find that I am in the pantry on a Saturday creating a 13-day week or a 21-day week, though I have found I cannot manage a 27-day week anymore. It's not a good practice, and I know it's not. Sometimes I fail miserably to observe the Sabbath myself. And yet, I think there is something of Sabbath in what we do at the pantry and in how we do it. And yes, you know I get there eventually, right? Our pantry guests, as you can suppose, are all too often the ones that don't have enough. But it's all too often not because they're not doing enough. Many, if not most, of our pantry guests are working not one, but 2 or 3 jobs, plus caring for children and or relatives with illnesses, with disabilities, or simply who are aging. But the way things are set up, those jobs simply don't pay enough. They're purposely kept part-time work because otherwise the employer would have to pay benefits, including vacation time, like taking a longer Sabbath, including health insurance that would give them some ease and protection in case of illness. Sometimes they're required to be on call for work, even if they're not going to be paid for that on-call time. But they can't do anything else because they have to be on call for that part-time job that isn't going to pay them for the time that they're being required to devote to it. Their hours are all too often so weirdly set up that it's going to be difficult to arrange childcare or ongoing adult education or taking that vocational degree or even finding another part-time job to help get the ends to meet. And then because those jobs don't pay enough, because they can't find work that does pay enough, they turn to others for help, to W-2 perhaps, to Wisconsin Infants and Children, to Women Infants and Children, to the Salvation Army, to us, to food pantries around the country. Some of them around the country, yeah. Which is a good thing and a good strategy for survival, and I'm glad that those services are there. I'm glad we're part of those services. But all too often, because they reach out to get help, they get scorned, they get labeled as lazy, or immoral, or lacking. Our society today, most of the popular media, most of the newspapers, a lot of the political reporting, puts a huge emphasis on self-sufficiency, on this idea that somehow, if you're truly successful, you don't need anybody else to help you out. It doesn't work. It's an illusion, it's a myth. Elizabeth Warren put it really, really well when she was at the campaign meeting last September. Some of you may have seen this on Facebook or in the news. There is nobody in this country who got rich on his own. Nobody. You built a factory out there? Good for you. But I want to be clear. You moved your goods to market on the roads that the rest of us helped pay for. You hired workers that the rest of us helped pay to educate. You were safe in your factory because of police forces and fire forces that the rest of us helped pay for. You didn't have to worry that marauding bands would come and seize everything at your factory and have to hire someone to protect you against this. Because of the work the rest of us did. Sabbath and its observance can, if we'll let it, remind us of this. That we are all dependent on God and dependent on each other and in community with each other. And that none of us is less or more worthy in God's eyes than anybody else. So it is my personal hope that at the Zion Personal Essentials Pantry, we provide a Sabbath experience, an experience of being accepted as fellow children of God, an experience of receiving freely from God's abundant grace and provision. Not the stuff we own, we're good people and we're willing to share it, but from God's abundant grace. And that each and every one of us, our pantry guests, has that. Jesus was accused by the Pharisees of having violated the Sabbath, of course because his disciples picked up some heads of wheat or grain on the Sabbath day. His response to that was to say that the Sabbath was created for human beings, not human beings for the Sabbath. We've been known to interpret this to say that we can do anything on the Sabbath. It's made for us, after all. No activity is beyond privilege for us. But perhaps it's good to be reminded that although all things may be lawful, not all things are good. The Sabbath is good for us because God does command us and encourage us to rest and to remember each other and God's bounty. So living in Sabbath, and continuing in a living Sabbath itself is a loving gift from God that I hope all of us will continue to enjoy and appreciate.